Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Anyway, we are talking now about the British High Street, and as you know, it is a hardy perennial of mine, but as with almost everything else that we've talked about a lot over the last few years, the rest of the world is finally catching up with us. 11,000 jobs at risk as House of Fraser announced 31 store closures, and Pound World, the Pound World chain, similarly reveals that it is having problems. There's a warning today. This is really interesting. There's a warning today that the high street, that the actual phenomenon of traditional high street retailing has reached a tipping point. It reminds me, actually, I'll have a story for you on Monday from the world of fruit and vegetables. I was looking into that report that there's going to be fruit and veg rotting in the fields. If you notice when you buy fruit at the beginning of the season, soft fruit in particular, that it gets cheaper. That when you start buying it, it's more expensive, and then as the season goes on, it gets a little bit cheaper because of supply and demand. There's more and more of it. This year, I'm told, by people who do know of what they speak, it won't get cheaper because the supply and demand isn't going to be there. You're not going to get the glut because they don't have the staff to pick the fruit. I know who I think should be sent out into the fields to pick the fruit, but might leave a gap in the LBC schedules. The conversation that we're having, though, now about shops is one that analysts have warned would represent a genuine sea change. I think they use the phrase tipping point. You know what tipping point means. It's a change that is not specific to the companies involved. It's a change to the very nature of the high street, the British high street. Now, you know I love shops. I only ever really worked in retail before I finally managed to persuade someone to give me a break in journalism. And I've worked in various different branches of retail as well, from the posh department stores and menswear fitters to the high street clothing shops like River Island, to the perfume counters at Beattie's in Worcester. And I love it's not unlike this job, actually. You get to talk to a whole bunch of people about a whole bunch of different things. I just have a little bit more control when I'm on the radio than I do when I'm trying to persuade you to buy a bottle of Davidoff cool water. God, I haven't said those words out loud for 30 years. That was Worcester Beattie's. I was the Davidoff cool water and Jupe. Do you remember Jupe? Do they still sell Jupe? They're lovely. It's nice. It used to be nice. One Christmas, I made so much money in commission that, well, I had a lot of money. The point I'm making is, what happens if it does change forever? 0345 606 0973. And what happens elsewhere? I've just noticed the first caller, or an early caller, is from Madrid. And he's going to be suggesting that actually in other countries the high street isn't dying, which is why I keep saying British. The British high street appears to be dying. To paraphrase Mark Twain, are reports of the British high street's demise exaggerated? 0345 606 0973. Do you agree with the employment of the phrase tipping point? Do you feel that something here has shifted forever? There's no going back. I'd trace it personally back to 16 years ago when Woolworths went under, and that strange sense that you have, crikey, Woolworths? That's part of the fabric of the high street. But at the time, Woolworths seemed a very specific example. It seemed that Woolworths was a victim really of its own management rather than of a broader truth, of a broader trend, a broader tide. This seems to me now to be almost reaching the point where the companies that can wash their face on the British high street are going to be the exceptions rather than the rules. And by retail, I mean you go in and you buy something and you come out with it, whether it's food or clothing. I don't mean that you go in and you sit down and you have your hair cut, or you get a tattoo, or you drink a coffee, or you have a massage. That's going to be part of the future of the high street, but I don't think that that so-called service sector is going to be big enough to replace everything that we've got. So we don't have long on this. We've only got about 20 minutes because I want to catch up with Matthew Thompson about the Grenfell Tower inquiry. It is today 5,000 jobs and 355 outlets that are under threat at Pound World as they seek 10 days protection to appoint administrators in a bid to avoid collapse. And it's another similar sum, another 6,000 jobs over at House of Fraser, 31 stores facing closure. We talk about this a lot, and I often forget to remind you, or at least to remind myself, there'll be hundreds of people listening to this now who are worried about their job. They're worried about their livelihood. They're worried about paying the mortgage. They're worried about putting maybe not quite food on the table, but not far off food on the table. And that is, yeah, I mean, that's why we have a kind of responsibility to address these issues. So come at it from whatever angle you want, but we haven't got long. Rajid is in Richmond. Rajid, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I enjoy listening to your show. Every day is interesting. I love it. I love it.
I love it. Oh, bless you. I love you. You're great.
Thank you. I just like, you know what I like about you, that you don't...
No. Talk about shops now. We've done the Mutual Appreciation Society. Talk to me about the high street. The high street.
Well, you know, James, I tell you, the shop, United Kingdom, every shop, high street looks the same. Boring. You just got few guys who own these shops, like Carphone Warehouse, like Top Shop, and they all got yachts somewhere parked up in the Mediterranean and counting their pounds and coins. And, you know, the only place I like the shops a little bit is Richmond. You know, you got nice, unique, quirky shops. And, you know, I come from India. India is a nation of shopkeepers. And you got small shops, you got big shops. This country,
medium-sized shop.
The people who are designing these shopping malls, they are pension fund holders. They're just after money.
This is an interesting analysis. So if we had lots of small... I mean, we were a nation of shopkeepers once. That's how Napoleon described us. But you're right, we're not anymore. We're a nation of shop workers. And the shops are owned by a tiny, tiny number of people. So you're suggesting that in towns like Richmond or countries like India, where you will have a multiplicity of small, medium-sized businesses, things could survive. But when you've got a homogenous money machine masquerading as a retail operation, that's when things will slide.
Definitely. I think what is going to come now in United Kingdom, after these high street shops are going to close because the council is charging 60 pence in a pound. I recently inquired a shop in Kingston and they wanted a rent 46,000 and then 24,000 pound rates. I said, where am I going to make this money? Who is going to make this money to pay you?
70 grand before 70 grand a year before you turn a profit.
Yeah, before I open the shop.
Good Lord.
And after I made some profits, the government wants a tax on it.
Right, we demand the tax, mate, because if you're not paying your taxes, the pavements on which your customers walk into your shop and the street lights by which they find you after dusk are all going to go out and disappear. But yeah, that rate, £70,000 before you've even sold whatever it is you sell.
Yes, and you know, James, I tell you what is the future going to be for the high street. It's going to be markets, small shops, and that is like Richmond has these shops.
Well, so does Kidderminster, oddly. I've mentioned a few times that my old hometown, where my mum lives, now has a market outside on a high street where a lot of the premises are actually shut. So, and again, you're right, the small stores with lower overheads. Rajid, I hope to bump into you in Richmond at some point. I shall let you buy me a pint. It's 28 minutes after 12. Adam is in Madrid. Briefly, Adam, I've only got about a minute before the news. What would you like to say?
Okay, I'd like to say that in Madrid and in most Spanish towns, the high street is booming because everybody lives in the centre above the shop.
Well, the people that work in the shop live above the people that work in the shop live above the shop, or...
No, everybody lives above the shop.
So there's residential...
People don't want to live 10 miles away in a suburb with a garden. People love living in the city. So every shop has got, you know, a captive pool of customers living in the building where they are.
I mean, I think of yeah, actually, you're right. Outside, because I mean, the high street I think of in my sort of corner of London now, that has a lot of people living above the shops. It's got a lot of residential space. But yeah, you think of towns outside big cities, and you're right. You come into town to do your shopping, or you don't. That's a really interesting point. But it's not something we can change. Is it? It's not something that we can reverse. Adam, thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off in your prime. With the high street, what's going to happen to the British high street, given that they're both ends of the scale, really, aren't they? That's why this story has prompted analysts and experts to describe a tipping point being reached. House of Fraser, historically quite a posh mark. Pound World, historically not a very posh mark. I don't know Pound World. I know Poundland well. I was in there yesterday. If like me, you have a sweet tooth, Poundland it's murder. You go in there, and of course you don't spend a pound. You never spend a pound in there. You spend £5, and you come out with half a ton of sweets. And also, I mean, where I live, Tesco is 2 doors down from me. You've got Poundland, then you've got Marks and Sparks, then you've got a Tesco, and then a little bit further up on the same side of the road, you've got a Waitrose. You could make a living, I reckon, following people around Waitrose, looking at what they've put in their basket, sprinting to Poundland, buying the same stuff, bringing it back and selling it to them, splitting the difference. So they've got a £3 box of biscuits in their basket. You sprint to Poundland, you get the same box of biscuits for £1. You sprint back and you sell it to them for £2. So they can put the £3 back on the thing. They've saved the £1, you've made £1. It's weird. I appreciate that's a slightly odd way of analysing people's shopping habits, but I have actually done it, especially with like 6 packs of Kit Kats and stuff like that, or you know, pot noodles. And the problem with Poundland, if you're not familiar, and it's not Poundland that's under threat, it's Pound World, I make that clear, but I can only speak of the one I know. The problem is it's very hard to be sure you'll find what you want when you go in there. With a few exceptions, it's a bit hit and miss. But that, to me, is a great business model. The problem seems to be that at the top end of the High Street House of Fraser, at the bottom end of the High Street Pound World, both today facing major problems, closures and potential job losses. So what's happening? And is it fixable? Is it fixable? Michael's in Hackney. Michael, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks, caller.
You're very welcome.
I'm in a situation where I've got shops which are on the top of the high street, and then I've got shops which are on the bottom of the high street. So I've got a optician. Oh yeah. Which is more like the top of the high street. And what
do you mean by top? Do you mean the posh end?
No, meaning to say that in optician, the one in my industry, I'm on the top end of the industry in my profession. So we are high-end optician. Yes.
So you got a smart shop, and then you got a toy shop which caters to a less well-heeled clientele.
Yes, and also obviously the toy shop caters for daily returns. The customers come back and for events, and opticians you don't expect them to see only once a year.
I wonder if anyone else in the world has got an optician's and a toy shop.
Probably not.
That's a wonderful little juxtaposition of entrepreneurship. Go on.
And I see that you nailed it just before you took me on air. Is the top end of the high street is suffering, and the bottom end, the middle bit is not as much. The top end is suffering as far as I see it. They can get things online for cheaper, and they will always compare. So people are not willingly to go to shop and just see what it is and just buy it. There's just a rather buy it online in 5-6 sizes, 5-6 colors, get it sent to the door. If there's anything they don't like about it, they just send it back.
Yeah.
And the bottom end is, like you said, the race to the bottom, there's no end.
So the optician is going to be fine because you need to go to an optician's. But the
optician is doing very well, actually.
Yeah, good.
People are spending more. People are willing to spend more because they read so much and see so much how you can spend less and you lose on the long run.
No, I hear it. I'm going to run out of time and the phone line's not great. Very, very briefly, will the toy shop survive?
Yes, it will survive. The only way it will survive is when bringing toys which are quality.
Oh, so okay. So I hear you. So finding that niche where people can only get it from you, as opposed to there being 10 shops where they could get it, and they'll go to whichever one is nearest. So that means more management, more careful buying, and better staff training, which means probably more suited to a smaller business than a big business. That's gone since I was on the high street. I know every old person says this, but customer service is not what it used to be. You don't get that sense when you go into shops now that you used to get when I worked in shops, which was the people cared. You do in some shops. I'm not maligning everybody, but there has, as a customer, I have detected a sea change over the last 20 years. John's in Derby. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Cards on the table. I'm one of these awful millennials who everyone's blaming for everything.
Prove it. Show me a card.
Well, to be honest, the last thing I've bought from the high street was probably a sausage roll about 6 months ago, and I really don't go to the high street because I don't really like it, and I don't feel the need anymore.
Gosh.
And
where'd you get your sausage rolls from now?
There's a small bakery around the corner which is also another part of a large chain. So, but the reason why I think the high street's going down is it's inconvenient. There's out-of-town shopping centres that are better. You park up next to the shop you want to go in. You go and get what you want. You come out again. It's 5 minutes rather than half an hour wandering around shops you're not especially interested in to find little impulse purchases. You're
But
not.
then, I mean, are you representative of your generation when you say that as a millennial? Don't young people like going shopping?
I think it's a little bit. Some people probably do, but I mean, I'm a kind of a nerdy guy. I'm not.
Well, you might just be a bit misanthropic. You don't like company and crowds and people. People like you have always existed. I don't know that it's a uniquely millennial phenomenon.
I kind of work in retail, so I get enough of that in my daily life.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. What do you see the future being then? What do you see the future of the high street being?
I think that we're not going to be going out to buy products because it's not the most enjoyable. I think we're going to be going out to do things we want to do, and entertainment's going to be more like going to the cinema, going to restaurants. That's more what we're going to go out for in the future, and there's going to be drone delivery, and we're already seeing it with Deliveroo and some of these other things.
Cinemas are struggling though as well, aren't they?
To an extent, definitely. I think a lot of the entertainment's at home, so it's not as necessary. But I think we are going to need to work to keep social interaction around, especially with automation taking off. Like many shops now have automated cashing assistants, so the social interaction's not there either. And I think there's with deliveries as well. I think we're going to get drones being delivered. So I think it's a symptom of society changing from a personal interaction society to a impersonal kind of.
And this is where I reach for my collected short stories of E.M. Forster, and he does an amazing dystopian short story he wrote, which I'm pretty sure is called The Machine Stops, where we don't meet anyone ever, even our own mums. We all live in weird little kind of fully equipped technological pods into which everything is delivered by sort of express tubes. I remember reading it as a kid. I loved it. I don't know why it stuck in my head so much, but this is what the best writers do, isn't it? This is what they do. They look at humanity and they look at the world and they make predictions about how things might change. Orwell basically wrote Brexit. Astonishing in a book called The English Revolution. It's a genuinely astonishing piece of work. Makes you feel utterly inadequate when you're trying to put together your own contemporary analysis of what's going on, as I am at the moment. And you realise that Orwell pretty much described what's going on. So did Steinbeck. Steinbeck got Trump. No such thing as poverty, only temporarily frustrated millionaires. And E.M. Forster predicted the end of the high street, the end of human interaction. Oh, happy days. Jonathan's in Finchley. Jonathan, cheer us up, mate.
James, another book you might have mentioned but didn't was Jacob Schumpeter. Now, Jacob Schumpeter was an economist like me, and he talked about creative destruction. And that is what we're seeing in the high street. My heart breaks for the people who've lost their jobs. Yes. But you can't buck the trend of economic change. The fact is that if you want to buy something, you can go onto Amazon, and they always have the right size. They always have the right colour. If you go into a shop, they probably don't have the right size or the right colour if it's a piece of clothing. So it's more convenient. But what I wanted to talk about was the way that the government is reacting to this change.
Yes.
And there are some important failures of the government. I'll give you an example. In London, people need homes, right? So shops are closing. People need homes. Now, there are a number of local councils which, especially in central London, which are resisting the change in land use from retail to residential.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely nuts.
Why are they doing it? If they were here, what reason would they give? Do you know?
I believe that the reason is that they believe that if housing replaces shops, it changes the character of the road or the character of the borough. But
yes.
We need homes. We need places for people to live. And the government changed, to its credit, it changed the planning regulations to make it easier to switch from, for example, retail to residential. But there are a lot of local authorities in London, especially central London, who have resisted that. So
and it's not out of some malevolent master plan. No. It's just a discomfort with change. It's small c conservatism, regardless of what party the council is.
Precisely. The other problem is landlords. Now, there's this thing called upward-only rent reviews, where a landlord never cuts the rent; he only raises the rent. And in a time when the high street is becoming more vulnerable, one obvious solution is to cut rents, but landlords I believe, are not doing that. So
because they think jam tomorrow. They think if we can just see this out, then the good times are just around the corner again.
Exactly. So that there are some economic failures here.
Yes.
Which, if they were corrected, you could help the adaptation to this process of creative destruction, which, as Schumpeter said, is inevitable. I mean, look what happened in South Wales. The coal mines closed. And people in South... I mean, I remember going to a garden festival in Ebbw Vale. I remember seeing Michael Foot there. And there were a lot of...
What's that got to do with the price of tea?
No, they're people who had been miners.
Oh, I see.
Who were changing, and they become hosts at the garden festival, right?
Yes.
They'd switched into tourism. And, we all have to be nimble in terms of... None of us are going to stay in the same job for 40 years.
Speak for yourself.
We have to be...
I'm going nowhere.
Well, you were in retail, James. You're an example.
Yes, I was, I thought that was going to be a stopgap before I got into journalism, and it nearly wasn't.
You reinvented yourself, and I feel terribly sorry for the people at House of Fraser, but they're going to have to, and the people at Pound World, they're going to have to reinvent themselves as well.
I hear you, and I understand why you're uncomfortable with the degree of sentimentality that perhaps emerges in these circumstances, because your sympathy is real, but the notion that things could be different is a little naive, perhaps. I hear you. I don't know that you've offered up a future of the high street, and I don't think you intended to, that resembles the one we've currently got, and the parallels with Wales and post-industrial communities, particularly mining. Tragically, that would involve massive public investment from central government, helping people find new roles, finding new lives, and well, back to Brexit there, aren't we? And the fact that most of the poorest regions in this country receive most of their infrastructure investment from Brussels. It may well be that it will continue to come pouring in from Westminster, but the miners would probably suggest to you that you shouldn't have too much faith in that prospect. That's me speaking. I don't want anyone to think I'm paraphrasing Jonathan, who I think we should all follow his example and go and read some Schumpeter. Where we turn our attention next to events this week at the Grenfell Tower inquiry. Our senior reporter, Matthew Thompson, has been keeping a very close eye on proceedings there, and well, I mean, it continues to throw up a curious mixture of controversy and concern, doesn't it, Matthew?
It does. This week, rather, the inquiry started its work in earnest, really. We had the commemorations, obviously, the last 2 weeks, but this is when we really started getting into the nuts and bolts of the inquiry's work. And on the first day alone, we got reports, very, very detailed reports from 5 expert witnesses, and a lot of it is very dry and technical by its nature, but I will try and just run you through the key points from that. I mean, the first thing to note is that forensic expert Niamh Nic Dade, she concluded that the fire started in the 4th floor apartment of a man named Bahailu Kabedi, and more on him shortly. But she said it wasn't possible to be entirely certain, but it was likely to be around the fridge freezer. They do think that the fridge was the cause of this fire. But she also, quite importantly, noted that it was more likely than not to be an accidental cause and not a deliberate act. Then we also got the most cited evidence, I think, of the whole week has been that of Dr. Barbara Lane. She's a chartered fire engineer. And her key finding was that the London Fire Brigade's stay-put policy, whereby they encouraged people to stay in their flats rather than evacuate whilst the fire was going on, that had failed within the first hour of the fire by 1:26 a.m., she said. And it wasn't actually changed, and people weren't instructed to start trying to leave the building until 2:47 a.m., by which stage, as we know all too well, it was too late for many of them. Barbara Lane also concluded that there were so many failings in the construction of the building, from the cladding, obviously, which was central to the findings, to the ventilation system, to the fire doors, that there was what she called a culture of non-compliance with fire regulations in the construction. And overall, from all of the reports that were presented, what emerged really was a picture of a building which was constructed in 1974 out of concrete, which isn't very flammable, and was constructed in such a way as to be fairly fire resistant, and also to facilitate this compartmentation idea, yes, whereby the fire stays localized to one hallway or one apartment. And actually what happened, what changed everything, was this disastrous refurbishment, which effectively saran wrapped the whole building in what we now know to be highly flammable material. So that's the sort of run through the reports as they were. The other thing we got on the first day that is worth playing is it's the first 999 call of the fire, which was made by Mr. Kebede, the owner of that fourth floor flat, and we will turn to him again shortly. But it's not particularly distressing, James, but it's just worth a little health warning that this is obviously an upsetting time, and made all the more so, I think, knowing as we do now how the whole thing developed from this moment.
Fire brigade.
Yeah, hello, hi, in the fire, flat 16 Greenfield Tower.
Sorry, a fire where?
Flat 16 Greenfield Tower. In the flat.
Right, hang on.
Flat 16 Greenfield Tower.
Flat 16, and what's the postcode?
W111TG.
W111T for Tango.
Yeah, but can you quick, please?
Yeah, would you just, I have to get the address. Okay, Glen.
Flat 16 Greenfield Tower, W111TG.
The fire brigade are on their way. Are you outside?
Yeah, I'm outside.
Yeah, well, the fire engines are on their way. Just tell me how many floors you got there.
It's 4th floor.
Right, okay.
Quick.
They're on their way
burning.
already. Yes, I know it's burning, but they are on their way. You've only just called, as long as you're okay. Yeah?
Okay.
Yeah, as long as
By the
you're...
free side, yeah.
Pardon?
By the free side, okay, can you quick?
Yes, you wait outside.
Yeah, I'm outside. I'm waiting outside.
Okay, so the fire engines are on the way. They will be there soon, okay?
Okay.
You've only just called us, so it will take a minute for them to get it.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'll look for that.
Can I let you go?
What is the stage journalist? Is the city? What is the city?
Hello?
What? Hello?
Can I let you go? You are outside, yeah?
Yeah, I'm outside.
Right, okay, bye.
Gosh.
Quite long, but worth listening to in full,
absolutely.
I think. But just chilling to think about
You can hear the terror in his voice.
Exactly, and the terror that would
And
spread.
of course, we should mention that the lawyer explaining the persecution that he's suffered since from people who've claimed that somehow he did it on purpose or that he might have had some sort of terrorist. Thankfully, I don't think any of the right-wing media actually went after him and started trying to make a meal out of the idea that he should somehow be forced to relive the trauma. I didn't see that in any of the newspapers.
No, there was some concern from his lawyer, which actually I think I want to play you a little clip of, actually, about the effect that the fire had on him more generally, but particularly the media intrusion, which had left him in a state of absolute terror to actually have to come forward and explain himself. But the idea, and as I mentioned at the beginning, this idea that the fire was found by Niamh Day to be more likely than not an accidental cause. He doesn't have much to explain, you wouldn't have thought, other than an accidental fire in his fridge. But his lawyer, Rajiv Menon, after the first day of reports, we got then a series of statements from lawyers representing the core participants, in particular the bereaved survivors and their families. And this is a little clip of Rajiv Menon QC, who is Kebede's lawyer.
The calamitous events at Grenfell Tower and the subsequent media intrusion have had serious consequences for Mr. Kebede and his family. His partner and children felt unsafe in their home and were forced to move out. The police were so concerned about Mr. Kebede's safety that they suggested witness protection, relocation, and a change of name. And without going into any detail, Mr. Kebede's health has been so severely affected that he feels terrified, and I use that word advisedly, terrified, about the prospect of being compelled to give oral evidence to this inquiry.
Now, that was on the Wednesday, but the day before we heard what I think was perhaps the strongest criticism of the whole week, and that came from Stephanie Barwise QC, and she's another of the councils representing the families, and she was very, very scathing of the what she called the silence of some of the corporate contractors who carried out the refurbishment, some of whom haven't even submitted opening statements to the inquiry, and she was very, very scathing in her assessment of that contribution.
Despite their words of condolence to the victims, these corporates have no desire to assist this inquiry, even though their participation could save lives in the immediate future. The inability to produce a basic account of how, if at all, they considered Grenfell Tower complied with the building regulations is itself indicative of the culture of non-compliance with which Dr. Lane has identified. The corporate silence deprives the families of the degree of resolution and understanding to which they are entitled, and has only served to increase their pain and uncertainty. It is inhumane to remain silent when so many seek understanding and answers.
And particularly, I think it's worth pointing out that Studio E, who are the architects, they haven't even submitted an opening statement to the inquiry. But as well as that, CEP is the company that supplied the cladding. They have submitted one, but all it says is, we can't say anything. And then similarly, Harley Facades, one of the subcontractors, they have submitted one page, barely a page, and it offers condolences and says it will cooperate fully, but ends it there, basically. Other notable things from the week, we heard from Imran Khan, another of the lawyers, obviously lawyer in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, quite prominent barrister. He called for the terms of reference of the inquiry to be extended to whether or not there was institutional racism at play.
We might ask whether this was a product of deliberate ethnic or social cleansing, or perhaps of segregation, or part of a policy of ensuring that if you were poor or from a BAME background, that you would be placed in the tower. Or was it pure chance and coincidence, just pure bad luck for some of those that died? Or was there something else at play? And so we submit that what occurred at Grenfell Tower may be explained as the product of institutional racism. And we consider it right and proper that this should be investigated.
There's obviously lots to get through. We're slightly running against the clock, James. But we also heard from the Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea, from the London Fire Brigade, all of them submitting evidence. The inquiry is now broken for a week, right, so we won't hear from it for another week, so we'll have to pause this little roundup next Friday. But the Friday after we'll be back, and the inquiry itself will be back on Monday the 18th of June for expert witness presentations.
Many thanks, Matthew Thompson, OBC senior reporter. Very, very briefly now, about 6 years ago, I went to the judo at the London Olympics, tweeted that I was there, and got a reply from a young fellow claiming that he was responsible for DJing and providing the music in the background. We had a little exchange on Twitter, ending in him asking me if I could get him some work experience. Well, I did, and he's become a very valued member of the team. Today is Axel Kacoutier's last day, and I'd like to take this opportunity to wish him all the best on his imminent campaign of world domination. That's it from me for another week.